Hi, and welcome to InfoSec Pros. I'm Kayne, Field CISO at Hyperproof, and I'm joined today by Dustin Lehr, Deputy CISO and Senior Director of Platform Security at Fivetran. Welcome to the show, Dustin.
Hey, it's great to be here, Kane. Looking forward to the
Fantastic.
discussion.
I'm so looking forward to it as well. And because this is a live stream, if you've got a question for Dustin or a question about Fivetran or about Hyperproof, please drop it in the comments on either LinkedIn or YouTube, and we'll take those as we go along. So first, let's talk about you, Dustin. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming the Deputy CISO and the experiences that have shaped your approach to information security?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started as a software engineer. I wrote code for 13 years. Okay. Variety of different industries. I was always the type who, wrote code during the day and then I would actually go home and have side projects and stuff at night. So learned pretty quickly, what to do in terms of building software, which always included a quality element, right? So I was always of the mindset of like making it work is just the first step, but thinking about all the other things that are involved in software, like making it maintainable, making it performant, making it secure, was always just something on my mind. So I pretty naturally moved into more of like a application architect type role, which led me into a security architect role. And then I was actually in the security industry as a security architect for about 4 months. And they asked me to lead an AppSec team over at Staples. So it was like, welcome to security. Okay, now you're a security leader, go. So it was a very interesting transition because as a developer, I was always heads down, like writing code, making it work, not talking to a lot of folks.
Mm-hmm.
But all of a sudden, as an AppSec leader, and this has been said over and over, and I totally believe this, that once you become an AppSec person in general, you become a salesperson because you have to sell this idea of security to your company. So I really embraced that. Really embraced the influence approach. Trying to influence people, trying to help them understand the vision for better security at the company. There was always a culture shift element and so forth. So I got really into that side of it. And then fast forward a few years, and I started working for Fivetran. This was about 2.5 years ago. Joined as basically the first official AppSec hire and built out a team and so forth. Just kind of inherited responsibilities along the way, worked my way up to senior director as well as deputy CISO there. So that's a bit about my journey.
Okay, that's quite the journey. And now I want to disambiguate some terms here because there's lots of different types of CISO, it turns out these days. Back in the day, there was just the CIO, and then eventually we got the CISO, and then we've fragmented it a little bit. Like I'm a field CISO, you're a deputy CISO. So tell the audience a little bit about how your role as a deputy CISO complements that of a CISO.
Start by just saying that every company approaches this slightly different. I'm not sure that there's a one size fits all deputy CISO job description. At Fivetran, it works a lot like the deputy CISO. At least my role is focused on kind of operationalizing a lot of the vision, the mission, and so forth that our CISO has. Right. So think of the CISO as sort of setting, why, having that leadership alignment. And so forth. Whereas me and my team, we're really focused on execution, right? So there's certainly, strategic initiatives and strategy involved in that, but that's the way that we've approached it, at least for Fivetran.
Okay, and so then, in your opinion, would you say that the CISO is more focused on strategy, as you said, and you're more focused on execution? Or are there any other differences between you and your CISO regarding application security?
Yeah, specifically around AppSec, for me, that's kind of my bread and butter, right? As a prior developer and so forth. Our CISO doesn't necessarily have an AppSec background. So he's looking at it, like you said, a little bit more strategically, right? Do we have an AppSec program? Yes or no? Is it effective? What's the charter of the AppSec team? And my team, essentially, platform security. And yeah, I'm a lot more tactical, right? So the teams that I run, I am more in the details as far as specific initiatives toward AppSec. Securing the SDLC is sort of the general mission of AppSec in most cases. And yeah, so I'm really focused on executing building good security habits basically
Okay.
with the company.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely necessary. And before we got on the show today, you were telling me that you had a side gig, is how you described it, about helping people to build a security champions program. Can we go back to that conversation? I know it was before we started rolling, but can you tell the audience a little bit more about that side gig?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. I think for me, one of the essential elements of culture change over the years has been to find allies essentially across your company. I don't think you can make an effective change at your company. And I think we can all agree that a big part of cybersecurity is making change, right? Because if everything was perfect and everyone was already writing secure code and doing secure things, then they wouldn't need us necessarily. So there's a lot of focus in general in cybersecurity toward building good habits across the company, which means changing behavior. And in my view, you can't do that with some sort of a note from an executive. You have to put concerted effort into finding people who believe in this vision, working with them closely. Could be a small subset of people, but then having it grow over time, right? And sort of winning hearts and minds and reaching people. So I've found that to be, absolutely essential.
Hmm.
And my side company really focuses on that aspect of it. I think people will state, hey, 80% of breaches are caused by human error. And then kind of run the other direction in a lot of cases, right? Like, oh, well, that sucks, but let's scan and do some other things. Like the people problem is too hard. And my side gig, Catalyst is what we're called. We run toward that. So we actually help people specifically build champion programs and help with culture change. We have services. We have essentially a product that helps gamify, which helps to motivate people and helps with engagement and so forth. So yeah, it's been a really fun project so far.
Yeah, I love that, and then it's about giving back to the community, which I think for those of us who've been in information security or cybersecurity, I just dated myself there by calling it information security, right? But I think it's important for us to give back to the community, and I think that you had written you wrote a guide or an ebook that was helping people to build security champion programs, and I think you also run a meetup online, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about those projects?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's called the Security Champion Program Success Guide. I essentially took everything that I knew and put it on a website, and I did it to help people, like you said. I think a lot of people struggle with where to start in terms of a security champion program, and there are common challenges as far as how to build engagement and how do you get people involved and how do you justify the time that people are going to spend on it and how do you justify this initiative to leadership? How do you measure it and so forth? So I put all of that into this website. And the other thing I'll say about the website is that, I really did try to design it to be open to multiple cultures. This is not a prescription as far as, hey, just do these three things and everything's going to be great. It's a little bit more of a procedure that you go through to understand your culture and to design a program that's going to be effective for your culture, which is extremely important because, again, you can't just drop something that worked from another company into a new company and expect everything to work. Yeah, so that's been a really fun project, and I'd encourage folks to check that out and give me any feedback that they have. And you mentioned a meetup, yeah. So I do run a meetup as well. It's called I co-founded it with two others. It's called Let's Talk Software Security, and you can find us on meetup.com. What makes us different is that it's an open discussion. Okay, so I see a lot of these webinars and podcasts, and they're great. One thing I wanted to do, though, was really give the audience more of a voice. So instead of it being people talking at you,
Hmm.
it's more of join and let's have a discussion, right? So we introduce everybody and then we actually get way deep into details. There's a lot of different questions that come out. There's a lot of different experience levels of the people who are involved. And it's just a great time. We spend 2 hours. 2 hours is not enough. We usually go all the way up to the end of that. And people are like, oh, I really wanted to continue talking. And then we have to end for the month. But it's a lot of fun. So I'd encourage anyone that's interested in software security to join us.
I love that. Yeah, and just as a reminder to our audience, because this is a live broadcast, if you're watching on LinkedIn or if you're watching on YouTube, drop a question in the chat, and we'll take those live as we go. And Dustin, as we move into our next section, I think that one of the things that's come really clear to me in this conversation, I hope it's clear to the audience, is you are, I'd say, you're a pretty strong advocate for culture change and establishing security champions inside of organizations instead of, as you said, just dropping in a fiat or a mandate from on high. So, walk us through the core objectives of a security champions program and then how that would actually complement an organization's overall cybersecurity strategy.
Yeah, certainly. So I think in terms of objectives, it's going to be culturally specific. Like I said before, I think that there are different types of things that you can do for your champions, but I think the common thread between most champion programs is it's a way to better reach people and start to shift their thinking in terms of cybersecurity in general. And the reason that they're so effective and why I believe in them so strongly is because, typically the security team is limited in size and thus not necessarily able to tailor their messaging to every single group that's out there. However, every group or every department thinks about security a little bit differently, right? Sales thinks about it differently than finance, and development obviously thinks about it a little bit different than other non-technical folks.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, well, how do you reach them effectively? And what I have found with these types of programs is to have an advocate who believes in security, who you've spent more time with, training and talking to, and kind of converting, to the security side to some degree. They also know their department. They are now great middle men or women who are able to translate your message of security into a context that their department understands. And that is what I think is one of the biggest benefits. And I think a lot of folks struggle with that. How do you effectively reach the people at your organization? And again, having those advocates on your side to speak on your behalf, on security's behalf, is huge. The other thing I'll say about that is people are actually more likely to listen to them too, right? The CISO's running around talking about security. Dustin's running around talking about security. Whatever. They're security people. That's what they do. They're easy to just ignore, whatever. But if someone on your team, on the sales team or whatever your team is, starts to share the same message, now you're going to listen because you're like, okay, you're not a security person and you're talking about security. This is different. This is new. This is something that I will listen to at this point.
Okay, so I'm hearing that these people are distributed throughout an organization. They've probably got to have some good communication skills. I think they also have to have a willingness to have a conversation with you or with somebody else who wants to start up a similar program. But from your experience, what are the other critical factors in really finding those right people and then giving them the tools and empowering those individuals so that they can become security champions inside of an organization?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I'll start with, what kind of makes a good champion? And you mentioned good communication skills. I think that's true. I also think that really where it starts is a general interest in bettering yourself and bettering your career in some way, and obviously a proclivity toward security in general. But I actually find that there is a wide range of skill sets as well as experience levels that we could use in cybersecurity that a lot of these champions bring to the table that you would never think of. Okay. As an example, non-technical folks like a marketing person as a security champion can actually help the security team quite a bit think about how they're reaching their audience, what to share, how to share it, and so forth. We could use that help. Right. So in terms of like, what is the perfect archetype of a security champion, and you must fit into this box in order to become a security champion, I would say open the box. Allow many different types of experience levels and so forth to come on board. So that is to say, there really are no hard requirements in my mind. There shouldn't be, because I think everybody can contribute in their own unique way. And what was the second question? Sorry, I
Just
forgot.
really, how would we empower them so that they're actually successful? Because it's one thing to identify people and say, "Hey, go talk about security," but if they don't have a security background, I can imagine that might be a challenge for them, right?
100%. Yeah. And I do, these programs take care in feeding. That this is not a set and forget type of thing. Hey, we have a champion program. You invite people to the champion community. Maybe you've got a Slack channel or something. You invite them. You set up some sort of monthly community meeting, and then you just leave them alone and expect magic to happen. Absolutely not. I think you need to be working very hard to continuously engage with them and give them resources. To your point, share articles, share podcasts, like this one, share things that you're finding interesting. And I think that's huge, because there's a connection that you can make with these champions. If you really just open up and start sharing with them, because they'll share back, and it's huge to build those relationships by having that two-way communication. So I think that's big. I also recommend a pretty methodical approach in terms of engagement with your champions. I mentioned these monthly meetings that you can have. People, everyone can get together, maybe center around some sort of topic of the month or something. Have some sort of maybe a presenter, an expert in the field come in and talk with them and sort of share things about, AI security or phishing or software security topics like OWASP top 10 and so forth, and just kind of have that theme of the month, and just be sharing resources and sharing things with them. I think that's really important. I also think in terms of what to share with their teams, I think it's also important to, sorry, there's some background noise. I hope that you can't hear that.
It's faint.
I have children. One of them is screaming right now, despite my best efforts at environment control here. Anyway, so yeah, I think it's important to share those resources so folks can share the resources with their teams as well.
And I'm hearing it's really an ongoing process here. This is not a one and done where it's like, here's a security thing, go read this, and then off you go, and you're empowered now. We do have a question from the audience, and it's a more technical question than we've been talking about before here, so I appreciate the thought that was put into this. And if you do have a question, please do drop it in the chat on either LinkedIn or on YouTube, and we'll make sure that we take these live. And the question is about strategies for integrating security controls into your CI/CD pipeline without impacting your dev speed, your development speed, or your operational efficiency. So a very technical question. Oh, Dustin, I think we don't have your audio right now.
Oops, I'm sorry. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So let me kind of start at the top, because I do think it should be a goal to try not to impact the development life cycle as much as possible. And I think whoever asked the question hit the nail on the head in terms of integrating into the CI/CD pipeline. And so let's focus on that specifically, right? Maybe you have something like a SAST scanner as an example, right? You're scanning the code that was just committed. Maybe you've got a PR that was created. It was scanned as well as the code base that is relevant to whatever change was made. And there was an issue found, right? So if we talk about that specific, obviously there's no issue found, there's no impact in terms of timing. But if there is an issue found, then there's a lot of questions. Do you block the build? Do you block the PR? Do you say, hey, this can't go any further, this can't be merged with main and go live until this issue is fixed? That's obviously very disruptive. So think hard before doing something like that. And you also have to have a lot of confidence in your SAST scanner. I think a lot of us have recognized by now that there's a lot of false positives in SAST. So what I typically do is I actually route that finding through more of an async type of procedure, where folks maybe get some sort of alert or notification, or the security team receives an alert or notification to look into the issue more deeply, and not block the build during that process, right? Let's say that you allow that to go through and you sort of have an investigation and so forth that happens in the background, where if the issue's now found to be valid, you can get back to the development team. I think it's also, if you're really going to try to not disrupt the process, I think you need to beef up your security team in terms of being able to triage issues like this. Because if they're overwhelmed, obviously there's going to be quite a lag, right, as they go through many of these PR type issues. So I hope that helped at least start to think about this stuff. I think we could have a whole session, frankly, dedicated to CI/CD pipeline integration of scan tools.
Yeah, I think you've got a great point there, and I think our audience picked up on that. And so, we've got another audience question. So, these are great. If you've got questions, please do drop them in the chat. And the question, you mentioned SaaS tools there. So, what's your stance on automated security testing tools versus manual security assessments as part of your, application development lifecycle? And how do you effectively balance the two?
Yeah, I think both are important, but I want to encourage everyone to kind of think about the SDLC for a minute and sort of the life cycle of software development. Because the way that I always like to think about it, and this is sort of a well-known term, is the left side and the right side, right? So shift left, right? We've all sort of heard that. I like to talk about starting on the right side, okay? Right side being production, right side being code that's written, things that are running. You can even include like test environments in there as well. The point is the developers have written the code. It's running, it's live. And I think that automated scanners are really important at that stage, as well as things like pen testing and so forth, because you can find where those issues are that made it all the way to production. And I like to start on the right because it's easier to make a case for other security practices if you can actually demonstrate that issues made it live.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have that, like let's say you do a pen test and you do a bunch of scanning and so forth, and you don't find any issues, you're done. What,
Yeah, I can see that.
apparently
It'd be
the
hard
dev
to get
team is
budget.
doing, the dev team's doing just fine, right? So if you could do those scans frequently and just make sure that the dev team's doing fine and continues to do fine, that's it. There may not be any other habits that you have to incorporate across your company. Okay. But that's not the case, right? Typically we find stuff large enough to warrant better practices. And now we start to shift left. Okay. Now we start to talk about things like, we were talking about CI/CD scanning, scanning in the CI/CD, or even further left and talking about threat modeling and design reviews and the stuff that's sort of designed to find architectural types of issues, which is where I would put, just to this question, a focus on sort of the architecture side really warrants more of those manual reviews. Assuming that's what they're talking about, there's also manual code reviews. That would be code that is more on the right side that's already been written. But I'm gonna assume that since they said automated manual security assessments, that it's a little bit more of like a threat modeling or security review of a design and so forth. And those are all designed to prevent issues from getting into the environment to begin with. Right.
Once
And
you've
they
proved
typically
that
focus
there are
on
issues to begin with.
Yeah, once you've decided that, then stepping back and looking at more of these left side activities. The question is, how do you prevent those issues from going live? And a very effective way to do that is by doing those assessments, is by finding those architectural type of issues way before the code's even written. And that's why it's so important to maintain a threat model. Do an initial threat model of your system pretty early, I would suggest, and then work with the dev teams to make sure that is kept up to date. A lot harder to do than to talk about it, because it takes work, and I don't think anybody really likes to do documentation in my experience. Technical folks want to be building stuff and writing code, which kind of puts us on the security side behind. Like we're always sort of chasing folks and asking them questions and can you document this? Or maybe we end up documenting things for them because they're too busy or they have no interest in it. But it really is in the benefit of everybody to have that sort of documentation, because I think it helps everyone, right? It helps the engineers understand their systems too. One more thing I'll say about this. I feel like I'm talking about a lot, but there's so much to unpack here.
There's a lot, as you said, to unpack with that question.
Yeah, and I think as you do these manual assessments, there's a major benefit for the development teams as well, because they always learn from them. You should, if you haven't experienced this yet, if you haven't done a threat model with a dev team, one of the coolest things that happens is as you start talking about the system in more detail, the developers will start talking, and they'll actually learn from each other. Oh, it works like that. I didn't know that. Why did we do that? And the more senior architect or whatever will say, well, here's why, and they'll question it. And it's just this great free flowing sort of open conversation and honest conversation about the health of the system that they've built in general that goes beyond security. It's just an amazing type of activity.
Yeah, it sounds like a good way of building camaraderie among the team as well. So I want to thank the audience for dropping that question in the chat. Really do appreciate that one. And if you have other questions for Dustin, please do drop those in the chat. I want to take us back to what we've been talking about previously, which was security champions. And you kind of laid out some ideas there around like metrics and measurements. So I know how you'd measure like code effectiveness. I know how you could measure, well, at least I used to know how you might be able to do code metrics and figure out how many bugs you've got in a given KLOC or 1,000 lines of code, that kind of stuff. But going back to the security champions program, what metrics do you use there, and what would actually indicate that it's being successful when you're running a security champions program?
This is such a great question. It's very similar to how you would measure the effectiveness of training in general. And I think there's a lot of questions around that typically come up in any good, cybersecurity program. Like, is this training effective? How do we prove that this training is effective? And the problem is you can't get into the minds of the actual trainees to see what effect that training had. You can't see a developer who was about to write some sort of bad code and they remembered the training they had last week, so they didn't write the bad code. How could you ever prove that, right? So really my focus is around building correlation, right? There's direct causation that is very difficult to prove with a training program as well as a security champion program. So I like to focus on correlation. And really what that means is, are you seeing some sort of material result that you can correlate with the training? And one of the ways to do that, well, there's two kind of general approaches that I like to use. One of them is sort of the A/B testing idea.
Okay.
We've got different groups, and those different groups may take different training or more training versus less training or whatever that is. And then you can take those measurements that you actually mentioned, Kayne, things like how many vulnerabilities are introduced into their code base. And you can measure those things, right? And as long as you do it statistically, if you do it in a way that is statistically significant, which means maybe you pick random people from teams, have a random sample, large enough sample size. We're kind of going into statistics here, but then you can actually make a very strong case that the groups, there was something different that was introduced if those results are different, right? And you can point that back to training if you've set up the experiment right. The other sort of dimension that I like to talk about when it comes to correlation is time. Right? So can you measure a before and an after? Here's what it was like before we had this training. Here's what it's like after. And if you're able to sort of isolate the environment in a way that you can prove that, then you can show that, hey, when we introduced this training or security champion program, we started to see this effect. There were less phishing emails where they clicked the wrong link. There were more phishing reports. There were more internal security issues reported by people. There were less vulnerabilities introduced in the code, you can measure those things after you've introduced the change and see if that introduction of change actually had an effect compared to the before. So that's typically what I like to do. Now let me just say a couple more words on this. It's hard because it's actually very
Sounds
difficult
challenging.
to isolate people in this way, A/B groups, as well as introduce like a single change. Because the thing with correlation is you can't prove it. You can't prove that was the thing that led to the change. Maybe there was something else. Maybe there was some security breach at, I'll just pick on Microsoft or something. And all of a sudden everybody was sort of generally more aware of security best practices. Maybe it wasn't your champion program at all. Mm-hmm. Right. However, I think you can make a pretty strong case if you set the experiment up correctly. So.
Okay, no, I love that it's planful and that you're planning for how to measure success so that you can communicate success and presumably get continued funding for this program, because it's probably not free. It's probably not high cost, but that goes to my next question about, this is not one and done. I think this happens on a continuum, right? And I'd be curious to know, like, how can you get people who security is not their main job? They are somebody who works in finance, or somebody who works in development, they're somebody who works wherever, right? How do you keep them engaged over time and motivated when they're not doing security full time?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that I have gone way down the path of investigating because, to run a successful program, to your point, it takes a lot of care and feeding. Like there's a lot of things that you need to do. Security is not the main job of folks. And you're trying to reach them to help change their mindset and change their behaviors. How do you motivate them? So the way I like to think about it is actually in terms of motivation in general, mm-hmm. and specifically around extrinsic versus intrinsic motivators. And this kind of speaks back to understanding your culture. Can you understand the people who you're trying to reach and what motivates them at the end of the day? Because maybe they're not intrinsically or naturally interested in security, but maybe there are other extrinsic things that they do care about. So I like to talk about things like rewards, and there's an acronym I love to use. It's SAPS, stands for status, access, power, and stuff. These are the different types of rewards that you can give folks that mean something to them, right? So the approach that I like to take is, maybe they're not intrinsically motivated to do these security best practices, but maybe you can, dangle a carrot, or reward them, recognize them, give them, higher status if they're consistently, reporting phishing emails or whatever that is, which looks like things like, badges, levels, right. Like thinking about kind of those gamification elements. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you start to introduce those things in your culture, they work very effectively, right? Like if you can highlight the best phishing reporter at your company of the month or of the year or whatever that is, and people get recognized in that way, that's a way to help build their career. It's a way for other people to see that and sort of have this social proof element where they say, oh, it's apparently important to this company to be reporting phishing emails. Well, I'm going to start doing it more now too. And maybe I can be the next, phishing email reporter of the month or whatever that is. And that stuff's effective. And then I mentioned levels as well. That's a way to really gain status, like as a guru in a specific domain, like especially, like developers as an example. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to be writing, great code and pumping features out the door. But if you become involved as a security champion and you can progress through some sort of a level system over time by getting involved, by doing things, taking trainings or just being more diligent with the code that you write or whatever that is, and you level up and you get recognized for that level up, that's a career enhancer. That, mm-hmm. How do you move from mid to junior level developer up to senior levels and architects and so forth? like we covered at the beginning of the call, it's thinking about these other things that are going to get you there. And if you can prove that you're thinking about security and thinking about these other things as well, you'll advance pretty far in your career. And really, these types of champion programs are a way to, kind of instigate or support that advancement of folks.
Okay, all right. So we've kind of talked about some of the pros there. Let's talk about barriers, because you've laid out some great ideas of how we can incentivize people. But based on your experience, what are some of the challenges there are for encouraging developers to actually have security as part of their workflow?
Yeah, I mean, developers are busy, really busy. I wrote an article years ago that kind of captured all of the things that developers have to think about. It's a lot. Okay, they're extremely busy, and if you slap one more thing on their plate without some sort of incentive, they're going to resist it naturally. They're going to say, "I just don't have time for that. How would I have time for that?" Right? So that's a major challenge, and I think this is where the culture shift comes into play as well, because I mentioned incentivizing them, making it important to their manager that this developer is not just writing code or features, but they're thinking about these other things as well. They're thinking about quality and security and so forth. And that goes on their performance review or whatever it is. Now they're incentivized, right, to actually take that stuff seriously. And you have to have that support all the way up through the management chain, right? Leadership and senior leaders have to emphasize this type of quality mindset. So if you want to talk about challenges, how do you convince your leadership to put quality or security as a focus of your company? Good luck. Like, this is going to take, if they don't naturally think this way, this is going to take years to make the cases to win their hearts and minds, right? To successfully influence them toward making it a priority to think about security. And I think the other thing I would say to that, just to clarify what I'm saying here too, is that, it has to be business specific.
Mm-hmm.
Like, security first mindset is the thing that I've heard.
Yeah, for developers,
I would say
definitely
not
very
necessarily.
popular.
Yeah. Why? Maybe that doesn't work in your culture. Maybe your product or services or whatever you're doing in your business doesn't require a security first mindset. Maybe security's item number 5. That's fine. Okay. It's just that the security risk level to your company has to be appropriate for your company. Right. So starting that conversation and having that conversation with leadership is really important. And it's hard. And I think a lot of folks who have kind of more of the technical background may hesitate to have those hard conversations, get the CEO in a room and make a case and have the data, like we were talking about, collecting metrics and all that, and doing right side measurements and showing that there's an issue. It takes a lot of time to prepare for those types of conversations, but you need to have those conversations if you want to see change at your company. So, yeah,
Okay.
I think we
Yeah.
more.
Yeah,
I
that
can't
kind of
help
covers
but offer
a lot
solutions.
around developers, and I want to up-level that.
Mm-hmm.
You were giving some ideas there for like talking to the CEO and actually trying to change cultures. What other advice would you give to organizations that want to change their developers' approach to security beyond what you've listed?
Yeah, I do think it's important to make the case. I think there's an element that developers, and especially technical people, they need to see it. They need to see the proof. There's a lot of hesitation otherwise, even if you've got a scan result that you share with a developer and you're like, hey, there's an issue here on line 30. If they're like, well, but is this exploitable? How would somebody do this? What do you mean an attacker could come in and use a SQL injection or whatever to attack this piece of code? I don't understand that. Taking the time to demonstrate that and sort of win those battles one by one shifts hearts and minds. as well. So thinking about it as a leadership level and really considering, you know, that side is big, but also down in the grassroots level, like every single time you can convince a developer in a specific instance that something is an issue and you can explain how that works and how an attacker could exploit the code that they wrote and so forth is an eye-opening experience for that developer as well. And then they start perhaps going down the path of learning more and sharing more with their friends and that sort of stuff. So I think thinking about it at the grassroots level as well as the leadership level and sort of coming at it from both angles is very time consuming, but I think is totally worth it. And you're gonna
It sounds very
be sort of
rewarding.
winning those battles one by one, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I wanted for our third topic, and I'll remind the audience this is a live broadcast. So if you do have questions for Dustin around secure code development or security champions, go ahead and do drop them in the chat on LinkedIn or on YouTube. We will take those live. But I'm thinking about external motivators. I spend a lot of time thinking about regulation and litigation, which is not my background, but I've certainly learned quite a lot about it. And I want to get your impressions on some governmental initiatives around secure coding and that concept that's going to be a driver to get organizations to change. I remember earlier this year that the was the White House's Office of the National Cyber Director, the what is that, the ONCD. They released a report saying developers should be using memory safe programming languages, which I know one pundit said was the best recommendation from 15 years ago that he'd ever seen. But before we get to that, I want you to share your thoughts on how the landscape of application security has evolved over the past decades, and how that's related to the solutions that we've seen over time.
There's a lot to unpack here. I do like the governmental awareness that's happening here. I like how they are sending notes from the White House, and there's certainly been a lot more focus on that in recent years. But to kind of go back in the day, I think when people started building software, obviously they didn't have security on their mind. And we've seen major breakthroughs. Like if you look in even the last 10 years, I think there's generally just more awareness around this from the news media as well as governments, and I think that there's sophistication on the attacker side that worries people as well. It's always this sort of push pull back and forth battle between attackers and defenders, and I think it's important that stuff is rising to the surface more. Now, in terms of the White House memo that you're referring to, using memory safe languages, I think it's a good recommendation. It's not a bad idea. I think that in general can help. And I was actually asked this recently at a conference as well during a panel, and shared my sort of strong reaction to that. I think as a developer is, why exactly are you dictating to me what languages I can use or not use? Isn't that more of a business decision?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't there potentially some benefit to your business for using one language over another? And why is a government body attempting to interfere with that business decision? Okay, now I could see more of a benefit, and this is where I get a little opinionated. What about all the other things that are wrong? What about the fact that the way that we audit our security controls in our companies is essentially not effective, right? What about the fact that complying with PCI is pretty easy? It's a lot of this check the box type of work instead of looking deeply into the actual practices at the company. I do think that government bodies and the White House should focus more on that. Like, how do we get better regulation? How do we get better policies? How do we, I do think it comes down to regulation, because I think, in a free market type society, you're not going to necessarily have a focus on that kind of stuff. And that's where I think, the government putting a little bit more emphasis um, into enforcing certain security policies and so forth across companies, either in the public or private sector. I think that's where the focus should be, not dictating which language we should use, but actually fixing our compliance and audit and system essentially. So that's where I
Yeah,
stand.
yeah, I think I agree with you on that. In some ways, and in some ways, I don't know. Like 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago, if I'd known that I'd be spending my day reading law journals and SEC filings from the Security and Exchange Commission, I'm not sure I would have gotten into this industry and thought, wow, like we can regulate our way out of this problem. But I think some of the systemic problems we've seen that have created that perceived need for additional regulation and additional regulatory controls are because folks weren't effectively communicating with the business. Like, I think if we'd had your Security Champions program 30 years ago, right, where there was a recognition that people throughout the business had to talk about security and had to take some part ownership of it and be mindful, I don't think we would have had the challenges of when I was a Unix administrator saying, hey, maybe we should have some kind of password control. Maybe we shouldn't be writing our primary application in C, which C and Corn Shell were some of my first programming languages. I struggle to call Corn Shell a true programming language, but it's before I learned Perl. But those weren't considerations, right? There was no consideration of like, oh, there could be a buffer overflow, or you just tried to bang the code out the door fast enough. And I think the continued failures of businesses to own the responsibility to
Yeah.
protect people's data and to protect their own corporate assets and secrets, I think that's what's driving to this more regulatory change, not anything else. I think it's, as you said, the media attention that's been put upon it and the consumer awareness, I think, is driving that behavior change, not necessarily some technological feature.
Yeah. And I think who is held accountable is something we should fix as well, right? Like CISO's taking the fall for, and I'm not talking about any one specific thing right now. Let me just be clear, but CISO's taking the fall for not effectively communicating enough of the risk or whatever to the CEO and the board or whatever it is, and therefore. Some security breach happens and then the CISO gets dismissed, or even worse, there's some sort of a punitive effect of that, sends the wrong message. I think at the very least we need to be focusing on the leaders of the company who aren't necessarily taking this as seriously as they should, instead of the people who are trying to make a difference. Because I think about this all the time, and I've seen this in the past where I'm trying to point out an issue. There's an issue at this company that we need to address, and if people don't listen to that, or I'm unable to, to craft the perfect message or experiment or whatever it is to prove that it's an issue, so I get ignored, and then something bad does happen. Who should be held accountable? And I think we need to shift that mindset quite a bit as well, because I do think people would be more willing to listen to folks who are trying to point out issues like this if they themselves, the CEO, the board, whoever, comes under fire if there's some sort of breach. So that's where I think the White House and some of our friendly government bodies should focus, is on getting that right and really thinking about how do they incentivize better security, both the positive, or I'll say both on the reinforcement side as well as the punishment side. How do we reinforce good behavior? How do we punish bad behavior? And that's really where I see the government having a big effect, right? Because they're able to sort of shift incentives and hold the right folks accountable.
Yeah, I think that is a great and nuanced point, and I'm just checking the time here. Usually, I think that is a whole other episode right there, talking about
Probably.
what incentives could we create for uh, third parties, for first parties through governmental controls. Dustin, any closing thoughts on, though, on just bringing us back to your primary topic of security champions programs and really folks being effective in the operation of those? Anything you'd like to say at towards the end of the show here?
Yes, certainly. I kind of mentioned this before, but I like to leave folks um, with this message. Um, there there are proven ways to influence and reach people. There are fields like behavioral science and psychology and so forth that we should learn from
Hmm.
to run toward what I would call the human opportunity or the people opportunity. Okay. Because the more that we can influence good behaviors at our companies, we essentially can build an army of defenders. Um, and I would just encourage people to run toward that, better understand their people, better understand their culture, and, you know, focus on making a change. It's a long road. It's hard.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think it's completely worth it. And, I think the technical side of the house is important, but I would just encourage us in general to focus on the people opportunity.
People opportunity and running towards hard problems. I do love that. And with that, I want to thank you for being on the show today, Dustin. If you're watching this and you know somebody who we should have on the show, or alternatively, hey, if you think you're that person who should be on the show, drop a note in the comments or just DM me directly. With that, Dustin, I really want to thank you again for joining us. And I want to thank our audience again for tuning in for today's live stream. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It was great to be here.